Look at her face for a second. Really look. One eye is finished, lined, painted, alive. The other is empty. Just hollow stone. And for more than 100 years, nobody has been able to tell me why she was left half blind. She is 3,300 years old. She is the most famous face to survive from the ancient world. And in 2006, a medical scanner meant for living patients was aimed straight at her, and it found something hidden underneath her skin, a second face carved into the limestone core, buried beneath the surface every one of us has seen. That is not a rumor. It was published in the journal Radiology in April of 2009 by a German researcher named Alexander Huppertz. And the face that scanner exposed is not the queen from the postcards. It is somebody else. Somebody the sculptor tried to smooth away. I have to tell you how I got here, because I remember the exact moment it caught me. It was almost 2 in the morning, and I had a photograph of that empty left eye socket filling my laptop screen, and I whispered out loud to an empty room, "Why would you finish one eye and abandon the other?" That single question pulled me down a hole I have not climbed out of since. Her name is Nefertiti. The bust is roughly 48 centimeters tall and weighs about 20 kilograms, and it has sat behind glass in Berlin for most of a century. Most people glance at it and see beauty. I looked at it and saw a problem, because the more I read, the less the story I had been told actually held together. So let me take you back to where it started. Not where I started, where she started. A dead city in the Egyptian desert, and a German man with a shovel who wrote 4 words in his diary that he could not take back. The date was the 6th of December, 1912. The place was a ruined settlement on the east bank of the Nile called Amarna, or Tel El Amarna. It is one of the strangest sights in all of Egypt, because it was a city built from nothing and abandoned almost as fast. A pharaoh named Akhenaten raised it as a brand new capital dedicated to a single sun god, and within a generation of his death it was stripped, deserted, and left to the sand. The man digging was Ludwig Borchardt, a German archaeologist working for the German Oriental Society. On that December afternoon, his team was clearing a building they had labeled House P47, Room 19. It turned out to be a workshop. And not just any workshop. The studio of a royal sculptor named Thutmose, a name they later found on an ivory horse blinker in the same rubble. Borchardt's own excavation log describes the moment. His workers uncovered a piece of flesh-colored stone, then the back of a head, then a neck, and then, as they cleared the dirt away, a complete and perfect human face emerged from the ground. He wrote in his diary that night one line that historians still quote, "Beschreiben nutzt nix ansehen." Describing it is useless. You have to see it. Think about that for a moment. A trained scientist, a man who had cataloged thousands of objects, looks at this thing coming out of the earth and admits his own words fail him. That was the first crack for me. Because a person does not write like that about a nice carving. He writes like that when something makes the hair on his arms stand up. But here is what stopped me cold. The bust was found lying on its side, near the far wall, in a room full of unfinished sculptures and plaster casts of faces. It was not in a tomb. It was not in a temple. It was sitting in a working artist's studio more than 3,000 years after the artist walked away from it, which raised the question I could not shake. Was this ever meant to be seen by anyone at all? And already I told myself, calm down. There is a simple answer for all of this. That is the reflex, right? You want the boring explanation. I wanted it too, so I went looking for it. The first thing I chased was the eye, because that empty left socket is the detail nobody can explain away, and it is the thing that hooked me before anything else. Here is what we know for certain. The right eye is inlaid with a piece of ground crystal quartz. Its pupil painted with black, held in place with a beeswax adhesive. It is stunning. Up close, it looks wet, like a living eye about to blink. The left eye has none of that. There is no crystal, no paint, nothing. Just the bare, carved limestone hollow where an eye should sit. Borchardt was obsessed with this. He believed the second crystal eye must have simply fallen out and been lost in the debris. So he did something remarkable. He had his men sift the entire floor of that room, They searched the rubble grain by grain, looking for a missing quartz eye the size of a fingernail, and they found nothing. Not a fragment, not a chip, nothing that had ever belonged in that socket. That absence is louder than any object could be, because if the eye had been fitted and then dropped out, there should have been traces, leftover wax in the socket, scratches, a residue of the adhesive, and the examinations found the socket was clean, never filled, which means the left eye was never finished in the first place. For a while, I sat with the popular theory, and maybe you have heard it too, the idea that the real queen, Nefertiti, had lost an eye, perhaps to an infection, and that the sculptor honored the truth of her face. It is a haunting idea, but it does not survive contact with the evidence because there is no other image of Nefertiti in all of Egyptian art that shows her with a damaged eye. Not one. On temple walls, on carved reliefs, on other statues, she has two perfect eyes every single time. So the missing eye is not a portrait of an injury. It is a portrait of something else entirely, a portrait that was interrupted. And that changes what the bust actually is. It stops being a finished masterpiece and becomes something far stranger, a model, a teaching piece. A prototype left frozen at the exact second the artist put down his tools. That reframing lit up everything for me. And if this kind of buried evidence is the thing that keeps you awake too, I want to point you towards something I have put together outside of this channel. I've written 3 books, First Threshold, Deep Signal, and Hidden Systems, that go deeper into the structures of concealment running through the ancient record, the patterns of what gets hidden, who hides it, and why the official version so rarely survives close inspection. Each one is $97, and you will find them all linked in the description at lostorigins.org. If Nefertiti's second face is the kind of detail that changes how you see everything else, these books were written for exactly that kind of reader. But back to the scan, because what Huppert's found when he separated those 2 layers is the detail that truly broke the case open for me. Because a workshop full of plaster faces suddenly made sense. Thutmose was the master. He was training sculptors, and this bust may have been the master copy, the perfect standard that apprentices were meant to study and reproduce, which is exactly why only one eye was ever inlaid. You only need to demonstrate the technique once. I felt good about that for about a day, because then I found the scans and the neat little theory I had built came apart in my hands. In 2006, a team at the Imaging Science Institute in Berlin did something that had never been done to this object at that resolution. They took the bust to a hospital and ran it through a computed tomography scanner, a CT scanner, the same machine that maps the inside of a human body in thin slices. The idea was to look at the internal structure, to see how it was built. The man leading it was Alexander Huppertz, and an earlier lower resolution scan had been done back in 1992, so there was something to compare against. But the 2006 scan was on another level. It sliced the bust into cross-sections less than a millimeter thick, and it revealed exactly how this thing was made, layer by layer, from the inside out. Here is the construction. At the core is a carved block of limestone. That is the skeleton, the actual sculpted stone underneath. Over that limestone, the artist built up layers of stucco, a plaster mixture, and modeled the final, flawless surface into that outer skin. So the face we all love, the impossibly smooth cheeks, and the perfect jaw is the stucco layer. And the stone underneath is the hidden foundation nobody was ever supposed to see. Now, that alone is interesting, but it is not the shock. The shock is what Huppertz found when he separated the 2 layers in the scan data and looked at the limestone face on its own. Because the stone face underneath does not match the surface face. It is not a rough version of the same thing. It is a different sculpture. Let me tell you exactly what the CT scan showed, because these are the details that stole my sleep. On the limestone core, there are creases at the corners of the mouth. There are wrinkles running from the nose down toward the lips. The cheeks are less full, with a slight hollow. There is a bump, a small ridge on the bridge of the nose, and the eyes on the stone layer are set with a subtly different geometry than the eyes on the surface. Then, in the stucco laid over the top, every one of those things was corrected. The creases were filled, the wrinkles were smoothed away, the cheeks were plumped, the bump on the nose was straightened into that famous perfect line. The face was quite literally retouched 3,300 years before anybody invented the word. I remember reading the radiology paper for the first time and just going still, because I finally understood what I was looking at. Underneath the most idealized face in human history, there is a second, more honest face. A woman with lines around her mouth. A woman with a bump on her nose. A woman who was aging. And someone deliberately hid her. The measurements make it undeniable. The stucco is not one even coat. Huppert's mapped its thickness across the whole face, and it ranges from almost nothing, just a fraction of a millimeter, over the eyelids and the tip of the nose, to a couple of millimeters in the cheeks and the areas that needed the most reshaping. The thickest plaster sits exactly where the corrections are heaviest. That is not random. That is a sculptor building up material precisely where he wanted to change the face. So the bust is two portraits stacked on top of each other, and that is the moment the tidy explanation. I had just a training model, just a workshop piece stopped being enough, because a training model does not need a secret face underneath. Somebody made a decision. Somebody looked at the real woman in the stone and chose to bury her under a more perfect one. Now, I know exactly what you are thinking, because I thought it too. And if you are the kind of person who does not swallow a mystery whole, this is the part where you lean in. You are telling yourself there is a completely ordinary reason for two faces, and you are right to push. So let me walk you through the boring version, the one I desperately wanted to be true, and show you the precise spot where it fell apart for me. The ordinary explanation goes like this. Egyptian sculptors often worked in stages. They would rough out a form in stone, then finish it in plaster to get the fine surface detail. So of course the stone layer looks a little different from the stucco layer. The stone was just the underdrawing, the rough draft, and the stucco was the finished art. The differences are just the natural gap between a sketch and a final painting. Nothing sinister, nothing hidden, just technique. I really wanted that to close the case. It is clean, it is reasonable. And for the general construction, it is even partly true. But here is where it breaks. A rough draft removes detail. It is simpler than the finished piece, but the limestone face under Nefertiti is not simpler than the surface in the ways that matter. It is more detailed. It has the wrinkles. It has the creases. It has the aging. The stone version contains specific, deliberate marks of a real, older, imperfect face, and the stucco version erases them. You do not add fine wrinkles to a rough underdraft and then plaster over them by accident. The realism was carved in first on purpose and then covered up on purpose. And there is a second thing that finished off the sketch theory for me. The corrections are not random smoothing. They all pull in one direction toward youth, toward symmetry, toward an ideal. The nose is straightened, the cheeks are lifted, the mouth is softened. Every single change makes the face younger and more perfect. A rough draft that just happened to differ from the final would differ in scattered, meaningless ways. These differences have an agenda. They are all editing the same person into a more flawless version of herself. That was the point of no return for me. Because once you see that the changes have a direction, you cannot unsee the intention behind them. Somebody was not just finishing a sculpture. Somebody was deciding how a queen would be remembered and choosing to hide who she actually was. And that is when the quiet part of the story started to get loud. Because if you have a hidden, more truthful face, the next question writes itself: who saw it and who made sure the world only ever saw the other one? Here is where the modern part comes in, and where the tools finally caught up to the mystery. For most of the last century, all anyone had was that outer face. The scans existed in specialist journals, but the raw shape of that buried limestone portrait was never something the public could really look at. It was locked in data, slices, and numbers. But recently, researchers and independent analysts have been feeding this kind of CT data into modern software using algorithms to isolate the stone layer, rebuild its full three-dimensional surface, and even reconstruct what that hidden face would have looked like as a living person. When you strip the stucco away digitally and render only the limestone core, you are looking at a face nobody was meant to see. And the reconstructions are unsettling, because that inner woman reads as older, more tired, more human than the icon on top of her. And that is the thing that pulled me all the way to the bottom of this. It is not just that there are two faces. It is that we spent 100 years worshiping the mask and never once asking about the person underneath. The reconstruction hands you the woman herself, the lines by her mouth, the weight of her real cheeks, the slightly crooked nose, and she stops being a symbol and becomes somebody who lived and aged and was quietly rewritten. But this raised something even darker in the record, and it is the thread I had been avoiding, because it turns the story from a mystery of art into a mystery of ownership. Who decided we would only see one face, and how did this thing end up in Berlin in the first place? Because the way the bust left Egypt is its own scandal. And it starts with that same man, Ludwig Borchardt, and a decision made in 1913. Back then, foreign excavators worked under an agreement called Partage, the Division of Fines. At the end of a dig season, the artifacts were split between the Egyptian Antiquities Service and the foreign team. It was supposed to be fair. A representative would look at the fines and divide them. On the 20th of January, 1913, that division happened for Borchardt's season at Amarna, and the bust of Nefertiti, the single most valuable object ever pulled from that site, ended up in the German share. It was shipped to Berlin, and for years, almost nobody outside a small circle even knew it existed. It was not put on public display until 1924, more than a decade after it came out of the ground. Now, here is the part that made my stomach turn. There has long been an accusation, argued over by historians ever since, that Borchardt deliberately downplayed the bust's value during that division. There is a surviving document, a record of the meeting, and critics point to the way the piece was described, listed in a way that undersold what it truly was. Some accounts say it was recorded as a painted plaster bust of a princess, framing it as far less significant than it obviously is. Whether that was a genuine mistake or a calculated one, the Egyptian side did not fully grasp what they were letting go. And the reaction, when Egypt finally understood, tells you everything. Once the bust went on display and became a global sensation, Egypt demanded it back. That demand was first raised in the 1920s, and it has never stopped. It was raised again and again across the following decades. Egypt has formally requested the return of Nefertiti more than once, and Germany has refused every time. The most famous woman of ancient Egypt has now spent over 100 years as a resident of Berlin, and the country she came from has never gotten her home. So follow the chain with me. A hidden face, deliberately covered. A missing eye, deliberately unfinished. A discovery so overwhelming the excavator wrote that words failed him. And then a departure from Egypt so quiet, so quick, and so contested that a fight over it is still going a century later. Every layer of this object, from the limestone core outward, is a story of something being concealed. That is the pattern that kept me up, because it stopped feeling like a coincidence and started feeling like a habit, the habit of hiding what this face really is. And it brings me to the thing I have been carrying this whole time. The single detail that, once I understood it, changed how I see the entire object. The buried finale of my own descent. Go back to the CT scan data, the actual radiology findings from 2009. Everyone focuses on the wrinkles and the smooth cheeks. But there is a specific, quieter detail in that scan that almost nobody talks about, and it is the one that broke the whole thing open for me. The eyes. Remember, on the surface, the right eye is inlaid and the left is empty. That is the mystery I started with. But when Huppert separated the layers, the scan showed that on the limestone core underneath, the position and modeling of the eyes was slightly adjusted by the stucco. The sculptor did not just cover a face, he re-aimed her gaze. He shifted subtle proportions of the eyes when he laid on the outer skin, tuning the final expression into that calm, level, almost unnerving serenity we all recognize. And here is what that means. The empty left eye was never an accident and never a lost crystal. The bust was frozen mid-transformation. We are looking at the exact instant when a real, lined, aging human face was being converted, layer by layer, into a flawless, eternal icon, and the process stopped before the second eye could be set. The missing eye is not damage. It is a bookmark. It is the moment of the edit, preserved for 3,300 years. That is why the diary line hits so hard now. Beschreiben nützt nix. Describing it is useless. Borchardt did not know about the second face. He had no CT scanner, but standing over it in that studio in 1912, some part of him sensed he was looking at something caught in the act of becoming something else. He just did not have the machine to prove it. The evidence was there the whole time, sealed inside the stone. It took a hospital scanner in 2006 and a paper in 2009 to pull it into the light. One researcher, Alexander Huppertz, looked past the beautiful surface everyone else was content to admire, and he found the woman hidden underneath. And now you have it too. The face beneath the face. The truth the plaster was meant to bury. So, what did I actually find at the bottom of all of this? I found that the most beautiful face from the ancient world is a cover story. Underneath the perfect queen is a real woman, older, imperfect, human, deliberately smoothed into a myth, with one eye left empty at the exact moment the transformation froze in time. We spent a century in love with the mask and never met the person inside it. If you have read this far, you already know you are not the type to accept the version printed on the museum placard. You are the kind of person who looks at a flawless surface and asks what it is hiding, and in this case, the surface was hiding an entire second face, carved in stone, waiting under the plaster the whole time. So let me leave you with the question that still keeps me awake, and I genuinely want your answer. Why would a master sculptor carve a real woman's wrinkles and creases in detail and then bury them under a perfect mask? Was he told to? Was he protecting her memory? Or was he hiding who she really was? Tell me what you think in the comments, and tell me where in the world you are watching from, because I read every single one. And if you refuse to let a closed case stay closed, if you would rather chase the buried face than admire the pretty one, then stay with me here, because the next thing I am pulling apart involves that same dead city, Amarna, and a set of royal graves whose occupants do not match the names on the walls. The bodies are there, the identities are wrong, and the official story is thinner than you have been told. Before you go, if this video helped, there's a deeper version waiting for our members. You can ask me your own question and a real person answers, and you'll be among thousands of folks just like you. Point your phone's camera at the code on screen. It takes less than a minute, and you can cancel anytime, no risk. Now, if that hidden layer amazed you, wait until you see what waits in Peru. Those ancient walls hold secrets we were never told. And the next video reveals them. It's starting right here, so stay with me.